Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. We look at legal issues that the film explores, and we also look at how law is important to understanding the film and what the film teaches us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates. This episode, we look at The Conformist, Bernardo Bertolucci's 1970 political drama set in 1930s Italy. The film centers on Marcello Clerici, played by Jean-Louis Trintignant, a mid-level fascist functionary who's ordered to assassinate his former professor, an anti-fascist dissident living in Paris. The film, which includes many flashbacks to Clerici's early life and decision to join the secret police, provides powerful and chilling insights into the psychology of conformism and fascism. The film, widely considered one of the greatest ever made, not only features outstanding performances, but also superb production design and cinematography that helps capture Italy under Mussolini. The film is as timely today as it was when it was released, as the world witnesses a resurgence of authoritarianism in the United States and Western Europe. Joining me to talk about The Conformist is Aziz Huq. Aziz is the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. A leading scholar of U.S. and comparative constitutional law, Aziz's recent work concerns democratic backsliding and the regulation of AI. His award-winning scholarship is published in several books in leading law, social science, and political science journals. He also writes for numerous popular publications, including Politico, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Aziz has an active pro bono practice and is on the board of the American Constitution Society, the Seminary Co-op, the New Press, and the ACLU of Illinois. Aziz previously served as a clerk to Judge Robert D. Sachs of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and then for the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the U.S. Supreme Court. Before joining the Chicago Law School faculty, Aziz was counsel and then director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Project, where I had the honor of working together with him, litigating cases in both the Courts of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Aziz, great to have you on Law and Film.
It's great to be here, John, and thank you very much for having me. I'm going to disagree with two parts of your bio. I think the more important disagreement is that John came to the Brennan Center while I was working there with an amazing docket of really important cases, and it was entirely my honor and my learning experience to get the chance to partner with John on those cases. I think the benefits from doing that accrued, yes, to the Brennan Center, but absolutely to me from what I learned from watching him litigate. But you already had a lot of experience litigating at that time, and I don't think there was really any benefit that flowed the other way. And then one very minor correction, which is relevant to the topic of the podcast, is that I no longer write for the Washington Post, a change that is not unrelated to the question of who today is a conformist.
Yeah, that's a very important correction to point out. And as to the Brennan Center, so we don't digress, we'll just say that the feeling is mutual, Aziz. It was an honor for me too. So let's talk about The Conformist. So the film is set in 1930s Italy. Mussolini's in power. What is the basic context so we have a little background?
I think today our image of fascism is refracted through a powerful example of Hitler's Germany, for good reason, because Hitler's Germany is associated with the moral abyss that is the Holocaust in a way that is distinctive and has no parallel in history. But we forget at our peril that Hitler was not the first fascist, that Italy under Benito Mussolini had moved into what Mussolini called fascism, I believe coining a term as a way of picking out a political regime in the 1920s. And the short version of that is that Mussolini grew up as a well-educated, well-read, but troubled kid, got into fights, was often entangled with the law because of his hot temper, became involved in left-of-center politics, and really took off as a political figure on the national stage when he was made the editor of a Milan-based newspaper called Avanti, that was a socialist newspaper. This really made his name. He broke, however, from the socialists and from the Marxist tradition around World War II. And in the wake of World War II, argued for a version of socialism that was national rather than international in character, and that had room for and that indeed centered ideas of family and faith in a way that the Socialist Party of Italy at the time had no room for. Mussolini began a campaign of civil unrest through what were called the Fasci di Combattimento, or the combat bands. These were groups of armed blackshirts who would go about disrupting, in particular, socialist meetings and organizations. The Fasci movement of Mussolini became important and increasingly prominent thanks to winning a significant number of votes, not in the first post-war election of 1919, but in the 1921 elections, in which the Mussolini's party took 35 seats. Not enough by any stretch to form a government, but a significant national presence thanks to their extra-legal campaign. In the following year, Mussolini led what became known later as the March on Rome. This was a march of something like 30,000 fascists, challenging the liberal government in Rome, arguing that they had failed to suppress the threat posed by the socialists. The socialists at this point were positing the possibility of a general strike. And under the shadow of the March on Rome, the Italian king decided to invite Mussolini to become the head of government. So Mussolini seizes power in 1922 through a mechanism that is lawful, but which is backed by an unlawful threat. And in the wake of that seizure of power, over the next decade, the space available for political organizing, the space available for criticism and resistance at what became known as the fascist government, narrows to a thinner and thinner point. There's a famous moment in 1924 when an opposition politician called Giacomo Matteotti was assassinated after giving a critical speech aimed at Mussolini. Eventually, Mussolini is dragged into World War II through an alliance with Hitler, and his government falls in 1943. Eventually, he's driven north, forms a kind of rump republic in a place called Salo. When that falls, Mussolini is dragged onto the street, hung from a lamppost, and his body is both defamed and maltreated in ways that have now become famous as an image of what happens to a dictator after they fall.
Yeah, that background is so helpful to kind of frame the film, even though it kind of zooms in on a particular person to try to talk about some of these dynamics. So it centers on Marcello Clerici, right, who's played brilliantly by Jean-Louis Trintignant. He is this individual who joins the fascist secret police. We see him sort of when the film opens on his way to assassinate his former university professor, staunch anti-fascist Luca Quadri, played by Enzo Tarascio, who's living in exile in Paris. And then through these flashbacks, we kind of go back and we see why Clerici first joins the secret police. And I think this, is a real window into some dynamics of, Italy under Mussolini and fascism. So why does Clerici join?
The film depicts a man who has experienced some kind of a trauma in early life. It's suggested that the trauma is the advance by a man who was a chauffeur within the family that Clerici rebuffs violently, ending in what he at least believes is the death of the person who made the advance, the chauffeur. This is a man who never gets over, on the film's account, this early trauma and is persistently troubled internally, not just by some sense of guilt, although I think there is some of that, but by a sense that his own repressed desires being out of step with those of a society. And so in the key moments in the flashbacks, and there is a flashback to the childhood incident with the chauffeur, but that's something of a setting up. The key flashbacks show us Clerici entering into a series of relationships through which he will be able to present himself as a normal and unremarkable member of society. One of those relationships is his marriage to a woman called Julia. It's not clear entirely to my mind how he feels about Julia. There are moments which suggest that he has physical passion toward her, that he feels some kind of sexual desire toward her. But there are many other moments which suggest that she is merely instrumental to him. She's merely a prop through which he can assert his membership, his belonging in a regular society. He goes to church at her request and confesses not just to his early, perhaps murder, but even to the fact that he's about to join the fascist secret police. And that's the other act of joining that we see early on in the movie. We see him going to the fascist headquarters and offering himself as a potential spy with respect to Quadri. And it's important to note that at the moment that he offers himself in this capacity, not only are his motives somewhat opaque, not just to the viewer, but actually to the person that he's talking to. But it's not clear from that conversation that what he will be asked to do is to kill Quadri. Indeed, what he seems to be volunteering for and what he seems to be accepted as is a spy, not as a killer. And I think that that is an important distinction.
You know, it's interesting as a side note, just to go back to his wife, Julia, for a minute, that's played by Stephanie Sandrelli. The one time he does exhibit passion, I think this connects to what you were saying before, is there's a scene on a train when she tells him that she wasn't, not was she not a virgin when they married, but that she had been sort of sexually abused as a young teen girl by, I think it was a close family friend or something like that.
I think they used the word uncle.
Uncle, yeah, uncle, actually, right, you're right.
But it wasn't clear to me whether it was a biological uncle or just a close friend of the family. Maybe there was ambiguity, or maybe simply I don't know enough about the way that the word uncle is used in Italian.
Yeah, but either way, that's the moment, right? When she reveals that, whether it's the biological uncle or the friend uncle, that there's some passion, which kind of goes back to some of the psychosexual trauma that's at the heart of Clerici's like character.
Absolutely. I think that there's two ways of reading the initial approach that Clerici makes to the fascist secret police, and two ways of understanding his psychology. And I think one is somewhat boring and one is interesting and generative. The boring one, which is the one that's, I think, most loudly semaphored by that early scene with the chauffeur. It's actually loudly semaphored right at the end of the movie, in the very last shot of the movie, is here's a man who has a sexual orientation that is off kilter with what society expects. And this is an instance of almost Freudian repression, where he is unable to express himself in the ordinary way that he would were society to be more open. And that anxiety and fear about the way that he can or cannot be in society is sublimated, is transformed into a powerful desire to belong at any cost. And that I think turns the homosexuality into a explanation of fascism writ large. And for reasons that others have pointed out, Pauline Kael, as you generously shared with me when we were talking about this movie before this podcast, Pauline Kael, the famous New Yorker film reviewer, made what seems to me legitimate criticism that to reduce fascism to an unexpected spillover of repressed homosexuality is to take a really complex and important phenomena and to trivialize it, and also to stigmatize homosexuality in a way that I think is profoundly problematic. But I think that the film is more complex and rich and rewards a slightly different reading, one that focuses not so much on homosexuality, but on Clerici's inability or difficulty in finding a role that he is intrinsically comfortable in society, and therefore having to actively reach out to situate himself, to make himself into the thing that society will accept at whatever point in time. Now, let me point to just one scene that I think illustrates a little bit of this. So there's a scene at which Clerici is meeting with one of the leaders of the fascist, maybe it's the fascist party, maybe it's the fascist secret police, and he's given the assignment with respect to Quadri. And then he is given a gun, and it's not clear why he's been given the gun. And he, as he is walking out of the room, the film breaks from naturalism, and there is a moment where Clerici first points the gun in the air one way, second points it in the air a second way, and then points the gun at his head. And it's a moment of sort of acting within the largely but not completely naturalistic world of the movie, which is also acted. And what are we to make of that breaking of the naturalist convention at that moment in time? One way to think about it is that Clerici is a person who is, in some important sense, empty on the inside. He doesn't know who he wants to be, but what he wants to be is untroubled and accepted. He wants to, as the title suggests, conform. And in seeking to conform, he is not entirely alone. So I think that one can read his behavior alongside the behavior of his wife, Julia, as parallel efforts to play out stereotypes of what it is to be a certain kind of person in Italian society in this time period. If you lack a certain sense of yourself, if you lack a certain sense of moral compass, if you lack a certain sense of substantiality from within, if you are to quote to refer to the title of a famous book from the turn of the 20th century, if you are a person without qualities. This is a famous book by Robert Musil, The Man Without Qualities. So one way of thinking about what the movie's about is what happens when a violent, authoritarian political movement, one that seeks to reshape the totality of social life, and we can talk about whether Mussolini was actually successful in that regard. What happens when that movement comes to a place where you have these kind of half-formed people, like Clerici, like Julia, who are mostly content to get along and go along? And what will they do? Well, they'll try and find ways of thriving in that world. They'll try and find ways of masking the gap in their own selves. And this is why I think that moment of rupture in the fascist office is important. It shows you that Clerici is looking for a role to play. And there's this very graphic moment where he shows you that he is seizing on a role in order to fill a gap that's inside him. What happens when authoritarianism, violence, intolerance meets a population of people who are half-formed? And I think you can read the film as not just a question of Clerici's homosexuality, which I don't think is actually at the end of the day all that important, and much more in terms of a sense of a person who is not in touch with himself, the sense of a person who is not in touch with his own moral compass, if indeed he has one, and the sense of a person who's not in an important way in touch with his own romantic feelings. He doesn't know who he loves in some important sense. And I think that this is what makes him vulnerable to the lure or the opportunities presented by fascism. And if you look at him in that way, if you look at him as a person without qualities, then gosh, it's not a story of somebody who has some exceptional predisposition or vice, depending upon what era we're talking about homosexuality in or what perspective we're talking about. He's a person who is vulnerable because of his incompleteness, his puttiness in the face of these buffeting and powerful social forces.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Think about his character that way. And one other contrast which just comes to mind is between him and Manganiello, right? Who's the sort of heavy that is tasked with accompanying Clerici to Paris and to making sure that he effectively goes through with the mission. Who seems in some ways, maybe a more typical, or what you might think of as a typical candidate for someone who would, join the fascist movement or party.
That's right. Manganiello is portrayed as somebody who had been in combat in Africa, maybe earlier in Mussolini's regime. The main events of the movie, as I understand, transpire in 1938, and Mussolini had invaded Ethiopia. I believe 4 or 5 years beforehand. The Ethiopian campaign was famous for its brutality. Some 500,000 Ethiopians die in that conflict. Ethiopia becomes famous militarily because the Italians deploy poison gas, and they deploy it at scale in ways that lead to quite horrendous losses of human life and suffering. So Mangiano is somebody who has come through brutality, who refers back to his brutality, and who has the kind of matter of fact, no nonsense attitude toward further instances of that brutality, and is manifestly irritated by Clerici's dithering and hesitation about the task of assassinating Quadri and the question of whether Quadri's wife, Anna, for whom Clerici might have feelings for, although that I think is again ambiguous. The question of whether Anna will become collateral damage. And so, what I think the movie is showing us here, not to suggest it's being didactic, is fascism takes many types. And there are the Mangiano types who move smoothly from one campaign into another, who seemingly enjoy the fact of brutality. And there are the people like Clerici and Julia who are incapable of sort of formulating what I think we today would call a spine in response to the pressures that are imposed by fascism. And then, of course, you have the professor, Quadri, and his wife, who take a very, very different approach, who respond to fascism in this very, very different way. And really, it's the tensions and the dynamics as between these characters out of which the conflicts and the drama of the movie emerge. And the fact that the dramas of the characters are overlaid with what might be a set of sexual tensions, which cut across the loyalties that are created or destroyed by fascism, and that complicate or render those loyalties at times suspect, at times impossible to perform without some sort of profound sacrifice or contradiction.
Yeah, it's so interesting because there's a line in the film when Clerici is being recruited about why do people join, right? And they say, so most people do it for power, for money, but few people do it for love of fascism. So it's to the extent there's some universal, there's sort of a host of reasons why people might join, but it's often for sort of other reasons that they would become supportive.
Absolutely. And I think that the reason that I'm trying to gesture toward, that I think is illustrated by Clerici and Julia, which is the sense of simply going with the flow and wanting to do well under the terms of the flow, whatever it is a really, really common one. And I think that once one sees Bertolucci is telling this story, and we should say that the story is based upon a novel by Alberto Moravia. When we see Bertolucci telling the story, I think it is to do the story a profound disservice to reduce it to, well, people who are repressed, people who have unusual forms of sexuality, at least as a statistical matter, are likely to become fascist. I don't think that that's his take at all. And I don't think it captures the ambiguities, the moral and the practical ambiguities that people necessarily confront. Although Mangiano does not confront, right? We see somebody who is completely comfortable and has completely smoothly moved from the world of killing Ethiopians to the world of killing dissidents. For others, this is a transformation. This is a new world in which it's really hard to figure out your place. It's really hard to figure out what sort of things you can and cannot do. What do you have agency over?
Sticking with the topic of what might be viewed as some deviant sexual behavior, right? From the other standpoint, do you think there's or does the film suggest that there's a tendency for fascist or authoritarian governments to define and delegitimize what they view as sexual deviancy? That was something that sort of really struck me when I was rewatching the movie, that there's an effort to really define from the top down, to define normalcy and what's not normal.
Where did you get that from?
As one of the pressures for one of the Clerici, it needs to or wants to conform is because of the way other behaviors would be viewed as deviant.
Well, that might be true, although I think that we see only the priest who Clerici offers his confession to making a judgment about sexual deviance. And the judgment that the priest reaches, which is condemnation, but also, how is it that you've sinned and you've taken so long to come to confession, I think that the way that the movie presents that suggests that this is not really a motive force, at least for Clerici, because Clerici responds to the priest by laughing at him. And he laughs at the fact that the priest is not concerned with the fact that Clerici might have murdered somebody, the fact that Clerici might have had these desires that are, by the standards of society at that time, were abnormal. What the priest focuses upon is it took Clerici a really long time to confess. So that Clerici laughs at this effort to impose sexual normality because it turns out that in offering it, the priest inadvertently or advertently reveals that the thing that the priest is most concerned with is the church's monopoly over discipline. And that self-interest makes Clerici laugh. It doesn't scare him. That's not the thing that worries him. The other thing that I think is worth noting here is that so much of the film unspools in Paris rather than in Italy. And we should have said maybe more clearly that the film starts out set on the morning in Paris on which Clerici is to go. And well, initially we think that it is he who is going to kill Quadri, or maybe Quadri and Anna. Right? Turns out that's not quite what happens. And I think that's another important disjunct in the movie. And then flashes back from that morning in Paris to both Clerici's life in Italy as a child, as an adult, getting married to Julia, but then also to the day or days that they've spent in Paris already. And so my guess would be that at least half of the movie is shot in Paris, and half of the movie is about being in Paris as an expat, an Italian. And one of the very striking and I think famous scenes of the movie, which takes place at a Parisian dance hall, is this long dance between Anna, on the one hand, who is Quadri's wife, maybe at one point had been Clerici's love interest in one way, shape, or form, although that's not fully fleshed out. A dance between Anna and Julia, Clerici's wife. And it is an incredibly seductive and sexual dance. And it comes in the immediate wake of a scene in which Clerici spies on Anna and Julia as Anna is helping Julia try on clothes in a way that, again, is suggestive that both Anna and Julia have non-heterosexual desires. They have, at the time, non-standard desires. And so much of the movie literally inhabits and then shows that we're inhabiting a world in which those desires are both performable in public, in the dance hall, and performable in private. So I think that once you recognize that there's all of those elements going on in the movie, it becomes harder and harder to see this as a movie about repression because, I mean, surely Clerici and Julia are presented with a image, a picture, a possibility of how they could live free given their own sexualities. And I don't think that Julia and Clerici's marriage is portrayed as being one in which actually either of them would care all that much if the marriage became a much looser marriage, if it became a marriage of convenience in which they pursued their own romantic and sexual pursuits. There is almost this sort of turn in the movie that does not happen, but that you could imagine happening, which suggests that what's at stake here is not merely sexual repression. It is not merely sexual liberation, because that liberation is on the cards. It's available. And just to put a point on that, there is a scene where Clerici is talking to Anna at her place of employment, which is a school for young ballet dancers. And it's an ambiguous scene in many ways, but one of the things that Clerici says is, "Run away with me to Brazil. I have contacts there. I can set us up with a new life there." And so there is this moment where he literally raises the possibility of stepping outside the frame, of turning a completely new leaf. And on the logic of the film, it is hard to see why he would have said that unless he, at least in some way, meant it. Although I think, at least my read of Clerici as somebody who doesn't quite know himself, who doesn't quite have a moral center, is, gosh, you should always be suspicious of what he says, because I don't think he even knows when he means something and when he doesn't mean something. But the "come with me to Brazil" moment is a moment at which I think we do see the walls of the movie, the confines break down, even more than they've broken down in Paris. And Paris, remember, is this is Vichy Paris, I imagine. Well, no, this is not Vichy Paris. This is 1938. Excuse me. This is prior, but this is Free Paris at a time when it really wasn't supposed that Paris would fall. The fall of France, remember, at the beginning of World War II, beginning of 1940, is pretty unexpected. It's not the outcome that most people think is going to happen. And so Paris is a place of freedom at this point, and yet, Clerici fails in this profoundly important way when put to the test of, which he prefers, his fascist sympathies or his feelings for Anna, or maybe his feelings for Julia, although I think that those are not as significant.
Yeah, and it would only be but I mean, they would have to leave fascist Italy. Like, he wouldn't be able to follow this. I mean, the scene takes place, the famous dance scene that you referred to takes place in Paris, contrast to fascist Italy. He would have to go even further to Brazil. I guess that's what I meant by some of the repressive qualities of fascism, repressing anything that's, not deemed to be sexually normal.
Yeah, but I would just, the only way I'm pushing back on that, I agree with that. And in the very last scenes of the movie, you see Clerici and Julia back in Italy, and you see them with a child. And maybe we'll talk about the scene where he interacts with the child, which comes directly after the murder of Quadri and Anna. And I think is meant to trouble us in a way that maybe no other scene in the movie is as troubling. That moment of contrast, I think, is really worth drawing out. But it is consistent with your reading that when they're back in Italy, they return to this heteronormative ideal of a nuclear family, of a child. And in some sense, the moments in the movie where Clerici is happiest, and maybe the only moments in the movie where Clerici is happy, are the moments that he's interacting with his child, which I think is another telling feature. But the only point that I was making is literally maybe half of the movie occurs in a space that is at least notionally free of fascism. Indeed, it's in a space where Clerici and his allies are the tendrils of fascism, poking into this space of freedom.
One interesting moment about Luca Quadri, Clerici's former professor, I appreciate this. I appreciate this as a professor. I wonder if you did, when he says it's impossible to teach philosophy in a fascist country. I found that kind of, a very kind of interesting, important statement that he makes.
Well, I know that we're going to talk about the present day, but why don't I bring that in right now? So as we record this, the Trump administration has said that it's going to crack down on what it characterizes as anti-Semitic speech in many US campuses. Columbia is at the forefront of these efforts. Now, one can think that there are certain kinds of speech that's anti-Semitic and therefore inappropriate. It's very hard for me to believe that under any reasonable definition of the term anti-Semitic, what the administration deems or puts under that label is in fact, anti-Semitic in the sense of being animated by dislike or hatred of people who are Jewish, or B, speech that is not integral to the enterprise of academic inquiry. And it seems to me that in today's order, in many of the orders around gender medicine, in many of the orders around DEI, in the quite extraordinary threats and reprisals against law firms that represent Jack Smith, the administration is not just expressing the view, but acting out the fact that it is impermissible to take certain positions and to defend certain positions, either in an academic context or in other contexts where the norm of neutrality and the norm of even-handedness, like the law, are supposedly paramount. And so I think that what Quadri says about the impossibility of being a philosopher is sharply presented and really can be understood in terms of the profound and agonizing moral problems that administrators and academics are having today in the United States under these threats of defunding, under these threats of criminal prosecution, for, let me be clear, engaging in speech that is at the heartland of the First Amendment, at the core of what we would call political speech. I'd flag one more point here, which is understood or read in context. There's a couple of nice little ironies in what Quadri says. So here's the first irony. It was well known that Mussolini, who, remember I said, was a very cultured person. His mother had been a school teacher. He had grown up learning a slate of languages and was apparently well into his political life. He would relax by doing translations of poetry. But it was one of the things about him that was well known was that he always had a copy of Plato's works on his desk. He might have had Aristotle's works too. I don't remember. But here is a man who was always at arm's length from philosophy. And yet, on the one hand, it is profoundly the case that totalitarian regimes from the Italian fascist regime onward up to the present day are preternaturally intolerant of independent-minded speech for the very fact that they cannot control it, for the very fact it is not subservient and it cannot be instrumentalized to their ends. And on the other hand, in the example of Mussolini himself, we see this person who is, in some sense, a philosopher himself. And yet he is capable of, at the end of the day, ordering the execution of the Quadris of the world. And so we should be alive to the ironies and the tensions and the internal conflicts in our society, in a society, that are implicated when Quadri makes this comment. The other thing that comes to mind is an important strand in contemporary American conservatism, represented, for example, by the Claremont Institute, is this strand of thinking that looks back to classical writers, Roman writers, and that finds justifications for all sorts of exclusionary, bigoted, in my view, discriminatory practices, but does it in a way that is actually profoundly learned, profoundly invested with the classical legacy of the past. And so, again, I think that we should be careful about drawing any kind of a facile distinction between, on the one hand, learning and philosophy, and on the other hand, the jackboot.
And the architecture, the way architecture plays is also interesting. And there's a lot of scenes of Mussolini architecture in Italy. The sort of architecture was done in the fascist period. But again, we see kind of today with efforts of the Trump administration to kind of define what the kind of architecture would be, although again, to kind of harken back, not to the brutalist style of Mussolini, but to what's viewed as kind of a classical style, to your point about reaching back for paying tribute to kind of classical Greco-Roman architecture.
Well, I think in both contexts, there's a sense of the organization of public space being in the service of a political project of conformity and hierarchical exercise of power. In Bertolucci's movie, I agree with you that there are many scenes that are just visually really striking because of the verticals or the horizontals, which are part of the vocabulary of brutalist neoclassical motifs that were common in the fascist arena. I would flag there's a scene early on in which Clerici goes to see the father in an asylum. And it's got to be the most visually striking asylum I've ever seen. It looks like an auditorium where everything is made out of marble and there are these benches arrayed across the floor of the auditorium. And the auditorium is presented through a series of tracking shots with Clerici moving through these ranks of benches, which look like they're made out of marble. And you have scattered across the benches a kind of motley array of mad people, people who are confined. And maybe that's a moment that underscores the point that you just made, John, about the performative quality of architecture. Although, gosh, isn't that an odd way to use that point about the performative force of architecture in the asylum context? It is, by the way, another moment in the movie where the movie decides to abandon the conventions of naturalism. It's not even an attempt to give a realistic portrait of what that moment would look like, and to portray something that is clearly Bertolucci has thought through how stylized this moment should be. But the stylizing at the moment is it opens up a set of questions about how one reads that moment. I think this is like the moment I mentioned before, in which Clerici breaks the fourth wall by doing these salutes and pointing the gun both in the air and then at his head.
Certainly one of the most chilling movie scenes is not the end, but towards the end. We'll talk about the end after, but the sort of climax, if you will, I guess, where Clerici, Manganiello, and the fascist team set out upon Quadri and Anna when they're on the road, ambush them, stop their car and then murder both of them in cold blood. First, Quadri is murdered by the fascist henchmen, and then Anna is also murdered. And before she's killed, Clerici has remained in the car that was trailing Quadri and Anna, and we see Anna come over to the car outside the window, pleading with Clerici to save her life, and Clerici just sits stone cold. I thought this was a very kind of interesting scene that has maybe a number of different interpretations, but maybe a scene about betrayal.
I agree that it's a striking scene. I think it's worth saying right at the beginning that the scene is immediately followed by a scene of Clerici with his young child 5 years later, at which he's warm and human and vocal with the child in a way that he hasn't been with Anna. And so the movie is drawing a contrast, and a very forceful one, between the Clerici who is capable. It's not that he is incapable of human emotion. It's not that he's incapable of mercy, empathy, warmth, or the like, because we see him genuinely performing those things in the subsequent scene. But in the scene of Quadri and Anna's killing, we see him. Well, I think that this is ambiguous, or I think it's underdetermined. I think that one interpretation, we see somebody who is frozen, who is suddenly at the crosshairs or at the crossroads of mutually inconsistent desires, the desire to conform and the sexual desire for Anna. So it's very clear that he has sexual desire for Anna, which in part is channeled into and through the sexualization of Anna's relationship with Julia. There is a moment where you might imagine that what happens is that he is simply frozen. And that's consistent with some of the things he says in the earlier scene to the henchman about his inability to act, the difficulty of performing. There are hints earlier on in the movie that he is not meeting Julia's sexual expectations. And so the theme of impotence is being raised in a number of different contexts. And so the first reading I would offer of that scene in the car where Anna is pleading with him is this is another moment of incapacity, of the inability to act because being caught between two conflicting emotions. I think the other reading of the scene, and I'm interested in what you think, John, is that this is a moment at which he chooses to switch off his emotions. He purposefully decides not to feel. And so if you take my reading of him, which I offered a few moments ago, as somebody who is the man without qualities, this is a moment in which he leans in. He decides not to have commitments, and he extinguishes the commitments that are within himself. And I think I lean toward the first and not the second, but I don't think that the movie clearly tells us which of those is going on. The hints that jumped out at me were the fact that on my reading of it, he does look out of the window directly in her face. I don't think he turns away, which you might imagine is one version of this, of the interaction, that he turns away. He won't even look at her. No, he remains somewhat unmovingly fixed on her as she begs and pleads with him. And the second point is that the gun is on the seat beside him, as I recall. And there is a sense in which he might lift the gun and either shoot her or shoot his accomplice and save her. And we see the gun not being moved. And so this is, there's a famous Chekhov line, or there's a famous joke about a Chekhov play, I believe it's The Seagull, that look, if you see a gun in Act 1, you know it's going to go off in Act 4. And the conformist defeats that expectation. The conformist has a gun. So there's a gun that's introduced early, and then the gun doesn't go off. That's not the gun that kills Anna. And so there is this sort of deferment or even denial of the pleasures of violence that the viewer has, because the viewer is expecting him to be the one that kills Quadri, at least after the Ventimiglia scene. And the viewer doesn't get that. The viewer gets a failure to act. And so I am torn about how to read that. I'm interested in what you think is going on in that scene.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he doesn't act, and he's labeled by Manganiello as a coward after, right? Ashadi had tried to save Anna, right, by trying to persuade her not to travel with her husband, with Luca Quadri, because he knew Luca Quadri would be killed, and that would save her life, and she probably would have lived if she wasn't with him. They weren't going to kill her. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like he does sort of decide and that sort of commit in a half committal way to the project. I mean, it's interesting, and maybe to also read it with what happens at the end and towards the end, which is where the government of Mussolini falls, right? That's at the film's conclusion. And there's kind of chaos out in the street. And Clerici tells his wife, Julia, when she asks why he's going out, I want to see how a dictatorship falls. And I think these final scenes are also very interesting. And one of the things which harkens back to something you were saying is Clerici seems to now play a new role in these scenes, right, where he denounces his former friend as a fascist. So I don't know, that may inform my reading of the scene in the car, but the aftermath is also very interesting because I do think he starts to play this other role.
I'm not sure we're supposed to think that that role is a different one, because he is, after all, conforming in his own way in the later role, just as much as he was conforming in the earlier role. So the later scenes, which occur in 1943, are occurring in the wake of the Allied invasion, and they're pushing Mussolini up through the north of Italy. I agree with you that there is an important element of watching Clerici adapt to a new era, a new moment, at which what it means to conform is different from what it meant in the past. And it shows how quickly people can adapt to these new circumstances. I will come back to a couple of things which really struck me, although I think maybe they're incidental to the overall way that it is presented. So one point that I would make about those later scenes is one of the other characters who reappears from the earlier part of the movie is Julia. And when I was watching, I had a very profound reaction to the fact that Julia in those later scenes is grown up in a way that she's not in the earlier scenes. She's very childish in the earlier scenes. And in the later scenes, she doesn't move the same way. Her hair is cut slightly differently. The actress who plays her, Stefania Santarelli, plays her as if there's a weight upon her that has made her into an adult. And so we see that relationship is different. It's not the relationship of disregard on Clerici's part, of contempt on Clerici's part that we've seen before. There's a child, and as I said, the fact that somebody who does this profoundly evil thing is immediately portrayed as having the joy of parenthood, of having the joy of the relationship with that child, is, I think, one ought to take that as this slap in the face to the viewer who was searching for the moral interpretation, for any kind of moral opportunity or possibility or judgment being executed in the movie. No, people will not get their just desserts. And that is played through in the scenes that follow, that Clerici, performing his new role, conforming to the new post-fascist regime, doesn't just talk about Mussolini as a dictator, which I think is itself telling, but then rats out, seemingly not to any immediate effect, his friend who facilitated the introduction to the fascist party in the first instance, in what Pauline Kael, I think, rightly notes as a none too subtle metaphor. The friend is blind, and there is a sense of the friend being particularly vulnerable. You missed out the very, very last moment of the movie, which is, so there's a peculiar encounter with somebody who might be the chauffeur. And it's not clear whether we're supposed to think it is the chauffeur or whether it's somebody who Clerici simply mistakenly believes is the chauffeur. But one of the things he does is he doesn't just point to his former friend and say he was a fascist collaborator. He points to the chauffeur and says, this man tried to rape a boy back in 1932 or 1928. And then both the blind man and the person accused of being the chauffeur, I think we're supposed to be unsure about whether it is, run away. And Clerici is left with a young man who the former chauffeur was trying to seduce. And there is a long shot at the end of the movie where the late adolescent, the chauffeur allegedly was trying to seduce, is lying on what looks like a bed in what looks like a sort of cell or an open storefront. And Clerici is sitting in front on the stairs and staring at the man's body in a way that is ripe with sexual feeling. And the movie ends with this long and lingering close-up on Clerici's face, which is at one level blank, but on the other hand is you're seeing the play of light on his face, the play of the torches, the play of the neon lights, in a way that, again, I think, I mean, if you want to read it metaphorically, it is emphasizing his emptiness. But it is also a moment where we're back to the desire, to the non-normative desires, where, here's the married man who has left his wife and child, said that he's going to go off to look and see how a dictator falls, and he ends up maybe at the cusp of a hookup. And that, I think, really complicates, or to my mind, shapes what's gone before. I think for the reasons that I suggested, I'm not keen to lean into Pauline Kael's reading of the movie. I'm not keen to say this is just about repressed homosexual desire. But I do think that there is this moment at the end where you think, it's not just that the normal person is willing to just kind of go along with whatever it is that the regime requires, however brutal, however terrible. But there's not going to be any consequence. And I think this was true for both Germany in the 40s and 50s and for Italy. There's very little by way of consequences for those people who committed horrendous acts of violence, murder, and worse. They found their way back into normal, quote unquote, society. And they were back in the position where they were grappling with their, emptiness, with their non-traditional, non-conformist sexual desires. And you're back where you began. After all of this violence, after all of this, the loss of Quadri, the killing of Anna, nothing made a difference for Clerici. And I think that's a profoundly, I think it's a moral message, although it's a profoundly demoralizing moral message. It's about the failure of us as a society, even in the wake of World War II. And maybe we should say something about the role that Italy plays in the Holocaust here, which I do think is not trivial, but it's not directly on point, but it's not completely incidental. In 1943, there's no consequence. I think that's really stunning and important to understanding the moral fabric of the movie.
Yeah, it is so interesting how he's kind of back at that moment. And he also now, assuming it was the chauffeur, Lino, I think his name was, and I think Clerici believes it was. So in Clerici's mind, it was. He also is now sort of, some sense, liberated from the idea that he actually killed this chauffeur, right? With the gun that accidentally, I think that he had accidentally shot the chauffeur. He's still alive. But he's sort of confronting these sort of questions and existential doubts or moments that he was back then, and kind of left, looking into a void in some sense.
Yeah, and nobody is punished except, I mean, Quadri and Anna are murdered. That doesn't count as a punishment. Nobody is brought to justice. There's no moment of reckoning. There's just life goes on, and in some ways, life goes on better. Clerici has a child, and the relationship with the child appears to be a loving and happy one. He is the only person in the movie who ends up even fleetingly happy. Gosh, that's a profoundly dismaying message to take away from that movie.
Yeah, and you can see just how easily he will shift in to the post-fascist Italy. As you said, it's a lesson about the lack of consequences.
Right, which, thinking about that in the present day context, it's, how many people will go along with, whatever it is that is done to non-citizens, whatever is done with respect to the people who depended upon drugs that PEPFAR provided, the Ukrainians who will suffer and die because of the Russian military advance and the Russian occupation. The list literally just goes on and on and on, right? The people who are perfectly willing to tolerate or even participate in those things. It's almost an optimistic point that you can just go back to normal. Things can flip back and people will just shrug their shoulders about what happened in a past moment of brutality.
Yeah, I mean, even as to like Ukraine, all the people who are lining up for support just flip. Support for Ukraine just flip when the political winds change. And so it's things like that to me make this, in some sense, the kind of animating forces and the dynamics around fascism that make this movie so timely.
And I think that the more one gets away from the Pauline Kael, it's just about repressed homosexuality reading, the more that one sees that what Bertolucci might be capturing here is a universal sentiment, where what's universal here is I think it is fair to say that most people have a kind of soft and molten core when it comes to morality. They don't have sharp-edged moral intuitions. Some people who are religious do, but then whether their religious intuitions add up together is a different question. But most people don't have hard-edged moral intuitions. Most people have very, very short horizons. They don't see that much beyond their own situation. They don't think that much about what's happening in places that are geographically distant. They don't think about the future, right? Which is the maybe will be our downfall as a consequence of the climate emergency. And those people are the Clericis and the Julias of the world, and we shouldn't pathologize them overly. We shouldn't treat them as abnormalities. We should see them actually as within in some important measure the mainstream, and a kind of case study in how people adapt. They get along in circumstances which are inhumane, in which there's terrible violence or suffering or evil in some form that is going on around them, and they're willing to. I mean, Julia will turn the other cheek in some way, but Clerici will, in some ways, pitch in some ways, watch while it happens and not get in the way. And I think that either turning the other cheek or watching and suppressing your own feelings or failing to act on those feelings, that captures, to my mind, much of what I think is likely to, it does happen in these contexts of authoritarian transitions, and may well capture a lot of what's happening in the US.
Aziz, if we could just go back for a second to a point I think you were going to make about Mussolini, Italy, and the Holocaust and its relevance to the movie.
The Holocaust has an Italian history as much as it has a German history. Mussolini signs on to the anti-Semitic program in 1938. So well after Hitler has taken many important and terrible steps down that pathway. But once Mussolini agrees to introduce anti-Semitic race laws, the way in which those laws are enacted is a far cry from the way in which they're enacted or applied in Germany in particular. And so while Mussolini spoke of setting up concentration camps, he never did so. He didn't go after people who protected Jews in the same way that the Nazi regime in Germany did. So there is a sense in which Mussolini's version of particularly the racial aspect of fascism was much less full-throated than the German version. And one way in which that's relevant to the conformist is the general view is that Mussolini just was never as successful as Hitler was at driving down fascist principles into the fabric of society. He was much less engaged in that project than Hitler was. And so much more of Italian society just kind of went along as it had gone on prior to the 1920s. Now, remember, it's Italy, not that old. The Risorgimento is in the late 1880s. But lots of stuff just ticked over, as I understand it from the historical literature, in Italy in a way that didn't really happen in Germany. And so in that context, Bertolucci's point about, well, people are just sort of living their ordinary model lives, I think takes on an even greater force, because I think it does capture something about the reliance of the fascist regime in Italy on cooperation as opposed to coercion, where I think the German regime can be fairly characterized as much more coercion and less cooperation. There's a great film also that touches on that aspect, the Holocaust aspect of fascism, which is Garden of the Fizzi-Contini, which actually, incidentally, if I recall correctly, Dominique Sando, who's the Anna in this movie, is also in that movie. But that movie's about an upper-class Jewish family, so in Italy during the war. So it's kind of an interesting, another interesting kind of piece about Italy during that period with a focus more on the Jewish issue. Yeah, and I certainly left the film thinking that, gosh, I should know more about this history of how society adapted in Italy to Mussolini's version of fascism. If in part because, maybe the knee-jerk tendency to think about the present moment in terms of comparisons to Nazi Germany is is illuminating because it turns out that there are multiple kinds of fascism. There are multiple strands or flavors, and maybe the flavor that's going to be much more. I don't think the comparison is inapt with respect to the last month. Maybe what the comparison we should be thinking about is the comparison to Italy in the 20s, not Germany in the 30s.
No, and I think when people take the fascist label, everyone thinks, well, if it's not Nazi Germany, then it's not fascism, which is maybe a spectrum or something varied and a spectrum. And I think this movie has a lot of insights into it.
I completely agree. People should watch the movie.
Well, Aziz, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to have you on and talk about The Conformist. And yeah, as I said at the outset, I think it's as timely now as it was when it came out. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's been great to be on, John. Thank you so much for having me.